Our moderator for this session is a highly valued colleague who's interacted with us throughout the HESN development, as well as with this particular laboratory on conflict development. Michelle Schimpf is the Chief Operating Officer of the Office of Science and Technology at USAID. Michelle.
Thanks, Ed. And thanks, everybody, for coming. I think this is really terrific because thanks to your participation, our goal is to be able to enable Texas A&M to be not only USAID's solution lab, but really a solution lab for the community related to conflict and tapping into their unique areas of expertise. So thanks very much. Very pleased to moderate this session. I understand that this is a continuation of a very fruitful discussion. Thanks very much, Ambassador Fraser, Claire Lockhart. Claire, I haven't seen you. And Clonda Raleigh for kicking off this discussion. I hope we can build upon that this afternoon. And I'm sorry, right now, this morning. The various panelists who I'd like to introduce, starting on the far end, Mark Whitten. Mark is a Senior Program Officer of Rural Development at the Aga Khan Foundation. He has extensive experience in South Asia studies with an undergraduate degree and an advanced degree in agricultural economics from London University. A specialist in the Asia region, and having been recently responsible for the Aga Khan Development Network's work in 5 Asian countries: Pakistan, India, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Afghanistan. Next, I'd like to introduce Haran Joe, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Texas A&M University. She studies insurgent groups and their compliance with international law. And the book she's working on has a very provocative title, tentatively called Compliant Rebels. And you produced a very, very interesting paper. I'm looking forward to the discussion. And then finally, very privileged to be here with Jack Goldstone, who is the Virginia E. and John T. Hazel Professor of Public Policy at George Mason University, as well as a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings. And I think, Jack, a lot of your work has been very formative to our thinking about democracy and fragile states within USAID for many years, and it's always terrific to hear your perspective.
Thanks.
So with that, I believe that you are kicking off this discussion.
All right, well, that's great. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and speak on these crucial topics. I wish I had more time, but try and be brief. First of all, I think as we've learned from the action of development agencies throughout the world, there really is no development without security. Now, I say that despite the enormous efforts of NGOs, government agencies, to work in conflict and combat-affected zones, where they do many good things. Roads get built, schools get built, children get educated, conflicts get settled locally. The problem is it's very difficult to sustain an ongoing autonomous process of increasing prosperity where you don't have basic security. You cannot keep kids going to school year after year if there's intermittent violence. Farmers will not be able to keep their crops and invest for the future. No one invests long-term in an area where predatory groups, whether it's the government or rebels, may come in, extract arbitrary taxes. It's just all the incentives in a conflict zone are to do what you can to stay safe, keep cover, not think long-term, but get through the day. And development, if we do it right, is a process of giving communities the long-term ability to sustain growth for themselves. And you just cannot really get that going unless you have security. It's also the case, I would believe, that there's no security without legitimacy. If people do not have faith that there are institutions in place to protect them, that there is somebody watching the police force, that there's somebody who's making sure the judges aren't all bribed, that somebody is watching out for their family and their friends when they leave the safety of their household compound, you don't have security. So what we heard this morning about building institutions at the local level, institutions that keep people safe and secure, are crucial. And third element of this, or third leg of this stool, there's no legitimacy without cooperation. And this is why I think Jendaya was right on target when she was talking about all the ways one can build cooperation locally, regionally, nationally, across different groups, across different elites. if people can talk to each other and start to build trust, you can start to build the human capital relationships that underlie the functioning of institutions. When institutions function, people have confidence, you get security, and once you have that, you can get a framework for development. What happened in Kenya, I think, is a very good example. We had all the ingredients for conflict in the last election, but the fact that elites had previously invested in institutions, that they had established some trust in those institutions, and that they were willing to abide by the decisions of election commissions and courts rather than act to raise violence through their supporters, made all the difference. So those are the overall. It's just, I think we do need to pay more attention to legitimacy and cooperation building rather than focus on security and development in the hardware input-output areas. Now, I was a little bit surprised to hear that secondary and tertiary education had been so undervalued. USAID has done a lot of work on youth in post-conflict settings, demobilization, integration, but apparently that hasn't filtered into the broader notion of youth being crucial for development. Now, this strikes me as odd for a number of reasons. First of all, if you're trying to spur development to reduce risk of conflict, the group that is your least concern in terms of conflict is children under the age of 10, right? They're the least involved in conflict. And if you can do everything you can to win them over, make them productive, improve their lives, there's no payoff for that in terms of conflict mitigation for 10 years until they mature. I mean, their parents may be grateful, it may help, but if you're focusing on primary school students, you're making an investment that you hope will pay off with productive and socialized adults 10, 15 years later. So it's very long term, it's very distant from the immediate conflict. What's more, if you're educating primary students who don't have role models, who don't have good teachers, who don't have ideas of what they're training for, what's their education going to serve, what job are they aiming for, what's their path beyond, where does high school lead, vocational education, then you're essentially setting them up for confusion, disappointment, and poor achievement. So you're investing in a group that's irrelevant for current conflict, taking an investment that won't pay off for 10 years, and you're probably doing it by not treating the full educational context in a way that will frustrate rather than benefit them. So I'm surprised to hear this. I do understand, however, that when people look at population groups, there is a tendency to say, let's target this group or let's target this space as if it was independent. And the lesson I've been trying to teach people in terms of understanding political demography is that you have to view population as an interdependent system with the physical environment and the institutional environment. So that populations have to be able to extract food, move about physically, have security, and engage in productive activities, but they also have to engage with an institutional environment that allows them to see how their life course will develop. Otherwise, they can't see how they socialize and fit into society. In a sense, madrasas do a better job of this than secular schools right now because they are part of a human social network. So when children get an education in that setting, they essentially know what life they're being prepared for. If we don't do that when we think about educational intervention from NGO and development point of view, we're not going to succeed either. And of course, in a country like Afghanistan, where you have roughly 15 million primary school-age children, and if 30% of them, 40% are being educated now, and we want to move to 100%, you're talking about adding 5 or 6 million children, largely women, into the school system. That means you need a couple of 100,000 new teachers. Where do you get them if you don't have a good secondary system? You don't need university education for primary school teachers, but you need secondary education and perhaps another year of field training and teaching. As we've seen, we recruit high school students to do our teaching in disadvantaged areas through Teach for America, but you need a strong secondary system in order for the primary system to be meaningful and competent. So I'm just surprised that MDG would target primary without realizing it's got to be part of a system. So building cooperation, Ambassador Fraser's program, I want to reinforce. I also want to say when we talk about building human capital to create local order, order exists in localities. It may be the type of order that Professor Wong said is set up by rebel groups, which is sometimes coercive, but so also is government order is sometimes coercive. So both kinds of order both the alternative competing order of local militias and rebel groups in ungoverned areas and the order where governments claim authority can be either coercive or supportive. Part of what we have to do in development, if we're going to empower local communities, is try and get governments to think in terms of creating order as doing through supportive means rather than coercive means. Because in many governments, the natural reaction, especially if governors have come up through military tradition, is to think of creating order and security through military means, which becomes coercive and doesn't lend to support for local empowerment and development. So we have to think of order in this bimodal way and be aware of what kind of order are we trying to reinforce. Also, human capital, it is a long-term, multi-level approach. The most useful thing you can do short-term for human capital is to address teenagers who are 2 years from employment and give them opportunities for vocational education so they can start looking at their future as, I can get a job, I can raise money, I can get married, I can have a family. Those are good things, I don't want to mess them up. If they don't have that confidence, they're prone to recruitment into any kind of organization that gives them a purpose, and that often is in an area that's weakly governed or ungoverned, an organization that has its own interests, separate or contrary from the government. So, yes, primary education is important, tertiary education is important, but the crucial immediate payoff in terms of reducing conflict, building social cohesion, is to emphasize secondary and vocational education. Among other things, recent work I've done has found that secondary education is also the most crucial for bringing down fertility. Much more so than primary education, secondary education empowers women to take a stronger position in the family, increase their earnings, acquire access to modern contraception. That's where you get the big payoff. So for that reason, too, secondary education is probably the key pivot. So investing there, but again, secondary education, you can't just train people for jobs that don't exist. Finding, I think as Claire said, doing some kind of census of, does the community need agricultural expertise? Does it need engineering road building expertise? Does it need administrative expertise? Accountants, nurses' aides, clinical workers. You don't want to educate too many university people to be politicians because then you're making political problems worse. You want to be practical in terms of thinking about combination secondary vocation because again, one needs to think about the people you're helping not as this person at this time, but this person as part of a broader social network that we would like to see evolve in a certain positive direction over time, building cooperative, productive relationships, being able to sustain those relationships, having the right mix of skills to make an economic ecosystem function. So education essentially for development rather than to meet targets. Now, it is good to hear, in a sense, as we've heard, that overall violence seems to be down. The biggest wars in Africa have been dampened through a combination of international and UN intervention and stronger local leadership. It's great that Kenya didn't erupt. It's great that Zimbabwe has put its currency on a firmer footing. It's great that the wars in West Africa have been largely dampened down. And even in the DRC, violence is less than it was a decade ago. All of these things are positive. But my concern is that these achievements may not be permanent if the next generation of young people growing up in Africa now, which is the largest cohort of young people in the world, does not see a future in these developments. And to me, this means there's a huge task that's going to require private sector as well as public sector work of training the next generation of young people. And we're really talking about 1 billion young people over the next 30 years to be productive players. This is the real challenge of this youth bulge in Africa. It was mentioned in the last panel that the youth bulge is not a predictor of conflict. That's absolutely right. I have a new paper coming out in an edited volume, Everything You Want to Know About Youth in Conflict, in which the argument is very clear. A youth bulge is a demographic phenomenon that has the potential to underpin rapid economic development if the youth bulge is essentially harvested by endowing that new generation with marketable skills, positive ambitions, there's this huge desire of young people to succeed and do something and make something of their lives. If you harvest that by giving them the skills, the opportunities, the infrastructure, the market structure to do something positive, you can get very rapid economic growth. The difficulty comes if you have a large youth cohort that is brought into cities, informal sector, personal insecurity, lack of, weakening of family ties, inappropriate or absent education, and institutions that they perceive as illegitimate. The trigger for me for a youth bulge, if the youth feel they're living in a society that treats their aspirations as unimportant or illegitimate, you can get conflict. If people feel that they are valued elements in society, you may get some generational tension and conflict, but not the kind of large-scale social overturning that we're seeing in North Africa, and that I think is a risk for much of sub-Saharan Africa, given the huge numbers we see. Fertility decline has currently stalled. We're looking at possibly 8 or 9 African countries reaching 100 million population by the end of the century. Those are the moderate projections. They may be worse in the next round of UN forecasts because of the fertility stall that's going on. So I would put youth at the center of conflict mitigation. This is also true in Afghanistan, in Yemen, Iraq. Many of the most difficult countries in the world today are seeing a huge surge of youth, in part because in conditions of uncertainty and lack of economic opportunity, having children is still the best insurance for families to strengthen them against rival clans or groups. Yet those children, if they're viewed more as an asset for defense and conflict preparation than they are as an asset for economic development, we spiral downward. So I think focusing on youth, particularly teens, secondary, entry-level, job entry-level youth, ensuring that they have the skills, ensuring they have the social networks, ensuring that there are institutions and elites that they can trust and that set a model for cooperation, all of that is critical. I have another paper coming out in a few months, in which we've looked at events around elections. And what we found is that you don't need everything to go well for an election to come off all right. But you need more cooperative events among elites than conflict events. So if you can kind of push the balance of elite interaction in the direction of more visible, explicit cooperative events than conflict events, you can make democracy work. And I think that, again, Jendaya was quite right to focus on that. So if you can do this combination, you talked about multi-generational planning. If you can get the current elites to start to cooperate to show that institutions can function, and you can give teenagers vocational skills and an orientation toward a functioning job market, I think you really get a country launched in the right direction. So I'm still hopeful.
Great. Well, thank you very, very much. Now I'd like to invite Mark Whitten to talk, and I think the emphasis on cooperation will dovetail nicely with your own remarks.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I think I would like to focus my comments on following up on some of what Claire Lockhart was talking about, particularly with community or the human institutional development of community organizations. I'm working with the Aga Khan Foundation that has got programs in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and India in the Asia region that for the last 30 years has really focused on building village-level communities and empowering them, building their assets, and with a focus on livelihoods. What we've noticed, I think, over the last 10 years is that there's been a tendency from these community organizations at the village level to federate and empower themselves through these federations. And this is really almost like a firestorm, you can say, that is spreading through our programs. It's not something that we've particularly been behind ourselves. Our focus was really at the village level, and we felt that's where our strength was. It's where we started in Pakistan and got a reputation in the 1980s. But communities, I think, recognize themselves the limitations of these quite small level organizations, where you're talking about maybe 50 or 100 households, and that they're quite limited in their ability to engage maybe with local government or to deal with some of these wider issues at a district level or a provincial level. And I think, first of all, I think it was our program in Pakistan that noticed this happening independently of them, that village organizations that they had set up over the last 20 years were federating into what are now called local support organizations. So typically you would get 20 or 30 women's organizations and village organizations federating so that they could access external resources. That was their first interest. Because what had happened in the 80s and 90s, there had been quite a lot of external financial assistance coming into those villages, and that had started to tail off. Basically, donors got a certain fatigue, one could say. They say, we've been helping this region for 20 years. We've seen actually a doubling of incomes over that 20 years. Really, you've had your turn. It's time for us to move on and go somewhere else. So the World Bank reduced their funding, DFID reduced their funding, SDC reduced their funding. And the sort of village organizations sort of were left thinking, well, what do we do now? So there was a way of, there was a sort of a desire to try and find a new role for themselves. And they felt that this federating way gave them, I think, first of all, their first initiative was that they could access more government resources. If they were stronger, they could actually go to the union councils, which were then sort of being devolved at that time. They could perhaps tap into some of the government funds, the poverty alleviation funds that were being distributed through government and through some of the aid money that was no longer going through, let's say, the NGO channel, but was going through the governmental channel. And I think people sort of said, well, how can we help? So these were these informal networks that were started up. And I think then the program there called the Aga Khan Rural Support Program, that I think Claire referred to as being one of the sort of ideas behind the National Solidarity Program in Afghanistan, they started to formalize this framework. And I think now that they've set up about 60 of these local support organizations. And the expectations is that this, will be a complete coverage in these northern areas of Gilgit, Baltistan, and Chitral. And there is now a national program with this RSP network throughout Pakistan in other provinces. So again, people refer to it as something of a fire, a local community, firestorm that's going through these community organizations. And I think in the context of conflict, we see that this scaling up of ability has created a capability to deal with some levels of natural resource conflict, for example, that they were not able to deal with before, particularly over water and pastures, particularly where you've got irrigation channels feeding a number of villages, or pastures which are being accessed, again, not just by a number of villages, but by people from quite far, from distances a long way apart. And so this has created forums for people to meet. And surprisingly, again, this is not being part of our initiative. We essentially have a livelihoods initiative. We were investing these through a livelihoods, but the communities themselves have seen the potential to deal with some conflicts through these frameworks. So, for example, recently in Tajikistan, there was an outbreak of violence in the head of Horog, the capital city of Badakhshan, on the border with Afghanistan. Sort of external forces beyond the control of local actors. But it became apparent to these federations of village organizations, or Mahalla committees even within the urban areas, that they could have dealt with this outbreak of violence themselves much more effectively if they had sort of been prepared for it. So now, although they weren't really prepared for it when this violence broke out, it took them by surprise, they are now reflecting about how they can use these federations, the Mahalla committees themselves, that is, the various sort of committees or groups around streets or neighborhoods, obviously are not able to interface with the people who are causing this trouble, which was the national government and a series of warlords, effectively. But as federations, they would have had a voice. So now they are reorganizing themselves and sort of reskilling themselves to be able to have a dialogue with the people who are causing the problems, who are living amongst themselves. And particularly the dynamic that happened there was with youth. And I think this is what we're also learning more and more over time, is that we've ignored youth. Effectively, we have been looking at building a capacity of heads of households or the income provider of households, and youth have to some extent being excluded. And what these communities are realizing, that actually the way that this conflict really took off in Horog was actually because youth suddenly came angered by what had happened, and the elders in the community were not able to control the youth. And so it wasn't the youth themselves who were actually leading the conflict. It was, let's call them criminal elements or whatever it was, that were using the anger of youth. They mobilized the youth to support them. So people who had been extremely unpopular one week suddenly became extremely popular the next week. And communities have seen that dynamic and said, we can do something about this. These are our sons, these are our daughters, well, mostly sons, I have to say, who have sort of gone off the rails for a time being. And it's simply, they needed larger frameworks to bring together leaders in the community who those youth respected and would listen to, and they needed that space and that framework to create that dialogue that hadn't been there before. They were unprepared for it. So I think that's what I'll wrap up my comments here by saying that our reflections over the last years has been that these federations really do empower communities to a much greater extent than these smaller level, village level communities. And I think to add to that is that this cycle that we've seen in Pakistan, now in Tajikistan, and I assume it will also happen in Afghanistan, is that funding tends to drop off after a period. And how do those communities then sustain themselves when that money drops off? So in Tajikistan, there was a period actually when our community organizations almost died away rather. And then they came back when they found a new role through this federating approach. And they've also started to create their own funds, their own investment funds through resources that they brought together through microfinance initiatives by bringing together the money that migrants are sending back. And this has brought a new life to these organizations without the need for external funding. So these are now more viable, sustainable networks. I think, I'll leave it at that. As been, I think, our major learning is that these federations have really taken us a step forward in our work in terms of effectiveness and sustainability.
Great, thank you very much. And now over to Haran Joe.
I want to thank you, previous panelists, for their interesting discussions. I think several themes are emerging from this discussion. The first one is going local, but stay national. People talked a lot about federating of local villages, getting youth involved. Clina also talked about having more disaggregated data for better evaluation. But Jendai mentioned that we need better balance between national and local institutional capacities. And the second theme, I think, is less is more. So nobody is talking about building big roads anymore. Getting right design, right partnership, I think, is very much emphasized. And Reiko also talked about being less interventionist and working with existing political orders in her concept paper and in her presentation. And I think the third theme is to go direct. And I think I'll emphasize this theme in my presentation. I want to advocate targeted humanitarian engagement. I'll abbreviate it as the approach, TEH. The basic idea is to go directly to perpetrators and victims to reduce violence. So the first thing you have to do is to target and identify you have to understand, of course, in the continuum of human and institutional development, but we want to identify some of the rebel groups or insurgent groups or even militias that could be engaged. And in my research, I find that rebel groups or militias that have some political wing, that could have some political influence over armed faction, that has command structure, hierarchical command and control structure, and whose finance is not really coming from natural resources, who are really dependent on international and domestic political constituencies, they are more likely to be engaged. And when we talk about material support law, these are groups that are not going to be in contradiction to material support law. So the State Department wouldn't really object to this idea, I think. So that's the first step, identifying which groups to be engaged. And I suggested DRC as an example. And there are, as Clinad suggested, more than 20 groups. And I've interviewed some aid workers, and there is space for engagement. So FDLR, for example, is weakening and is willing to talk. And some of the factions in my groups, they have very deep-rooted local relationship and are willing to talk about these kinds of humanitarian engagement. And even M23 is, even though their core interest is to gain international legitimacy, they are open to this kind of dialogue. So these are the potential candidates in the example of DRC. And once you target and identify these groups, you go on to humanitarian engagement. And what kind of engagement should be done? You could help those groups that have internal command control structure to develop some kind of discipline and code of conduct. And there are several cases that were successful in that. And here, we cannot really ignore the power of political knowledge. So in one example, MFDC in Senegal, they were dependent on civilian support. And when they recognized that their use of anti-personnel mines were killing a lot of their supporters, they had this aha moment and said, oh, we're not going to use anti-personnel mines anymore. So having these kinds of opportunities of educational reckoning moment, I think that would help some of these targeted rebel groups to be engaged. And I think this could be done with little amount of money once we have right groups to engage and once we have good partnership. And it could be done in 2 or 3 years because we have local NGOs as well as international NGOs that might be interested in this kind of agenda. And UN is also interested in monitoring and verification functions after this investment is done after 3 years. And it could have long-term effect. Some of the rebel groups are, the average longevity of rebel groups I find in my research are 10 years. Some groups last more than 60 years, but they are often perpetrators of violence, so if they are to be engaged, it could have long-term effect. And it can be assessed and evaluated using ACLID data, or if we could have some kind of natural experiment in DRC and Myanmar, as I suggested, we could have multiple groups in one country. Some of the groups will be engaged, some of the groups will not be, and those experiments will be done at the local level, so we'll have some villages that are engaged, not engaged, so we could have some leverage for future evaluation as well in those areas. So that's my idea, and that's the third theme, go direct. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very intriguing presentations. I think what will be most useful to us is if we can start to hone in on what we think might be the candidate research questions that we think would be fertile in this arena, rather than, this isn't a choice of, which solution seems to have most merit. It's about what don't we know and what do we need to learn through more time. With that, I will invite the first question. Oh, you sure?
I'm honored. I need no introduction because I spoke last time. I'm struck across...
Actually, I don't know who you are.
You weren't paying attention. Jerry Brown with the Institute for Economic Stability. I'm struck across all these discussions, and one of the, as a practitioner, such as it is, across a number of these topics, a sort of trade-off between short-term stabilization and what we want to build long-term. And this has come up time and time again. And, when you're at the pointy end of the spear, Ambassador, you get to guess where I used to work with that expression. In the long run, we want all these kids to go to school, right? We want an end state where every child is, we have 100% literacy. But in the short term, we may be best focusing on the people who are causing the most problem, right? The people we hate the most, the people we've got to go educate, all right? And there must be some way of proving empirically what has the most effect. I'm struck by Lester Thoreau's comment, no capitalist would ever educate his kids because the payoffs are so far in the future, the ROI just isn't there. Sorry, sir, but keep doing it anyway. I'm struck with sort of engaging with these rebel groups, right? We could make a decision about, do we engage with the LRA, right? Which in the short run might be a wonderful thing to do and have, very positive humanitarian impact. In the long run, it might exacerbate the conflict. So it's a research question. There's, one of the things to focus on is, okay, for people who are, chief of party, chief of mission, chief of the military command, whatever they are, how do you help them break apart the short-term impact and the long-term unintended consequences versus, I want to build this wonderful end state, but it doesn't do anything to address the, the immediate drivers of violence and instability. So if you could have that done by the end of the session tomorrow.
I think, and just to echo that, I think having sat in the midst of the Afghanistan and Pakistan budget battles for the last 3 years, that kind of, if decisions were being made based on evidence, that debate, about, on the one hand, is everything about near-term stabilization and supporting the fight, because that's what ultimately is the big drain, versus, and there's a whole community on that side of the house, that everything to advance that is the right thing to do. And then largely another community on the development side of the house, which is anything you do to support the fight is wasted development dollars, because you're not tackling long-term. And maybe a different way to frame it is to be, what are the interventions that best straddle and achieve effects on both sides? So anyway, this is an interesting comment. Would you like to, anyone like to respond?
I hear this all the time because in the real world, budgets have to be set and priorities have to be made. But it's a strange question. People think of it in terms of development. Now, if you're building a bridge and your engineers come and say to you, if the cross girders, the visible supports, are lousy, the bridge is going to collapse. So those have to be good. However, the foundations, we can make them weaker and the bridge won't collapse for 10 years. So can I save money on the foundations in order to put money on the things that could break next week? Now, if you're a corrupt, predatory government, you say, yeah, let's take all the money for building the bridge now, and if the foundations won't crumble for 10 years, we won't be around then. It's okay, we'll run off with the money. But if you claim to be a responsible government and you're building a bridge, you wouldn't build a bridge that will work for a few years and then collapse. You'd have to say, somehow we have to allocate our budget, even if maybe it means building a smaller bridge so that we have money for both the foundations and the cross structures. And development's a lot like that. There are certain things you can do that are very important for the long term but have very little immediate visible payoff. Other things that you can do today that will show you improvement tomorrow but won't last by themselves. And it shouldn't be either or. It rather should be, if we have X amount of money, how do we allocate it? I think the bigger unknown in terms of research is how much progress you can make at the local level while the national level is still disordered or partially legitimate. Can you actually build, like Aga Khan, can you build from the village level up, and maybe is that productive? Or does building from the village level up run into major limits if the national government is not constrained? And that one is one I'd really, that's a more important trade-off to me right now than long-term, short-term.
I think it's really a difficult choice, and I think Ed and USAID will make the final choice about these difficult decisions. But I think it's really difficult to choose which intervention to have when you have a mouth to feed in IDP camp, and when you are thinking about the long-term effect of education among youth. And I suggested this kind of intervention into rebel groups because it is feasible and it is less interventionist. And just to be clear, LRA is not on my list of candidates to be engaged because State Department wouldn't like it. It's on the foreign terrorist organization list, and it would be against the material support law. So that's not on my list. On my list are some of the Myanmar groups, KNU, KNPP, some of the DRC groups that have potential to be engaged. And in terms of conducting humanitarian negotiation, not to fuel the conflict, we have to be very smart and rely on expertise of humanitarian negotiators. So, for example, rebel groups are interested in funneling the resources, humanitarian resources, to the regions where they have core supporters. And we don't want that. So we have to know where their core supporters are before negotiation, not to have that kind of disastrous consequences. And we have to negotiate smart to better the lives of detainees, for example. So there are a lot of details that I want to talk about humanitarian negotiation, not to fuel the conflict, but to prevent conflict and to reduce violence.
Yes, I mean, I think in our case, to take it down to a very sort of practical level, we're often trying to build in the incentives for long-term benefits into our short-term actions. So, for example, we'll take a livelihoods approach with the community, but building institutions which we think will have much longer impact. So we may not go into that community and talk about those longer-term impacts. So, for example, I mean, we're trying to work with these federations to see to what extent they can work with local government and improve the workings of local government. But we don't walk into a local government office and say, here we are coming along to try and build your capability. I mean, they would laugh at us. So we don't talk about some of those long-term benefits, but we try to create the incentives for those local government officials to work with our communities so that they can see some practical, immediate benefits to themselves. In other words, their reputations are enhanced by working with these local communities because suddenly things are happening that never happened before, and so that they feel better about it. But we're just not explicit that we have a local governance agenda. I mean, we may be in forums like this, we can talk about it. I didn't talk about it earlier, my talk about that agenda. I was talking about, we're working primarily with communities. But that does have a further agenda in terms of local governance. We've recognized over this time there's a lot communities simply can't do. You need the authority of government to solve some problems. And those linkages, up to the enabling environment at national levels to give legitimacy to some of these groups. So the way we work is sometimes maybe a little bit sort of indirect by looking at short-term incentives that create the opportunities for those long-term benefits to flow in time without being explicit about it.
Please.
Yeah. About education, I think some of the focused education is needed to reduce violence. So among the victims of child soldiering, some of them are coming from families that are voluntarily sending their kids to be child soldiers. And those families don't really know the options that are out there. So if we have educational program or vocational training that could be complementary to this approach, we could tell them these are the options, and voluntary child soldiering, volunteering for child soldiering might not be a good option. Your children might not be coming back. So giving them options and thinking about future consequences of them. Al-Shabaab, a lot of families in Somalia are sending their kids voluntarily to be child soldiers, and same for Myanmar groups. Some of them just think that they are my ethnic kins, and they are not going to harm my children, and they are not really thinking through those consequences. So I think long-term education is a good thing, but some of the education that could be really focused on reducing violence is another aspect that we often ignore.
Can I ask how much you all feel is really known about the effectiveness of those kinds of programs? I've seen them over the years, and the U.S. government and other international donors spent a lot of money on trying to, turn former combatants into, productive individuals in society. The verdict that I had heard out of many countries over time was that it does a good job of taking them out of the battlefield, and it does a good job of putting some money in pockets or providing some educational opportunities, but I don't see a sort of the more economic-driven case, nor necessarily a lasting stability. And I guess, Mark, I'd also invite you to say, you were teasing out the question of to what extent the federations had a capacity to channel youth energies away from violence, but I didn't quite get the verdict on that. So I'd appreciate how much you think these kinds of the use of resources for these truly do get an economic bang, or a sustainable bang, or simply useful in the near term.
I think we don't know yet. It's really, I would say maybe that is a research question. We're uncertain on it. We see that there is a demand from communities to use these forums to try and engage with youth. Particularly, say northern Pakistan. I mean, there I think it became most evident to us that these community organizations, or then particularly the federations, were seeing the problem with youth, basically. I mean, intergenerational problems with young men who basically, the politics of northern Pakistan, people being influenced by external people from outside, the Pakistan Taliban, basically coming into those areas that are relatively peaceful in the past, engaging with those youth, changing their attitudes and actually creating conflict within families. So those families themselves saw an incentive to work through community organizations to try and deal with that change in attitude of youth. But we don't know. I mean, it's very difficult to say. We don't have any concrete evidence at the moment as to change.
I'm sorry to give you a negative answer as well. We don't know yet. The primary reason why I suggested this policy is it's feasible. It could be done within 2 or 3 years. And it sounds reasonable. But that's going to be my second book project, actually. And that's primarily why I suggested DRC and Myanmar as focus countries, because we could get at the evaluation, because we know the violence patterns, we know the lineages of these rebel groups, and we can find some comparable rebel groups, and we could, if we have this kind of implementation policies, we could possibly get at the village level variation to really get at the effectiveness of these interventions. So we don't know. I'm trying, but but we'll see probably in 10 years what might materialize.
Well, I'm a little more positive. I think the effect to look at in terms of the demobilization, getting guns out of the hands of young people, it's important for the broader public security. The question is not if you take someone out of the army, take away their gun, tell them to get a job, do they become productive citizens 5 years later? Often not. They have mental health problems, they have adjustment problems. If they can support themselves at a minimal level without causing harm to others, then that's quite an accomplishment. But it's the broader social order that allows other people to become more productive is what you buy by getting private militias, putting them out of business. In a country like Guatemala, where guns were left in the hands of young people even after there had been formal agreements to stabilize the government, you just have a horrendous criminal problem. If you have young people who know how to use arms and have not been who have not benefited from rule of law themselves, they go into business for themselves after the peace arises. I think the progress we've seen in Sierra Leone and Liberia was very much contingent on demobilization programs there. Guatemala, I think, is a failure. I think DRC, we haven't seen enough yet to know. Sudan is going to be an interesting test case in the future. But I do think what we know so far is that the social peace you gain through even a partially effective demobilization program targeted at youth has broader social benefits, and it shouldn't be evaluated just in terms of the economic placement of the people who went through the program.
Even though we don't really have systematic evidence, there are some evidentiary episodes. So KNU, for example, signed an action plan with the UN to stop the use of child soldiers, and the progress has been okay. And then it's not perfect compliance, of course, because there are still lower ranking soldiers that are using child soldiers. And in Sudan, for example, SPLM signed such an agreement in 2001, and then other Darfuri groups followed. SLA signed 2007, and then GEM signed 2012, and the progress has been okay. And it's very recent policy intervention. We don't really have systematic evidence, but there are some instances where we can point out some successes.
Thank you. Ed, you were going to ask something?
Three quick questions on youth. Over the last 15 years or so, often I've talked to governments about why don't we have better, stronger youth programs, Iraq particularly. We were working on all kinds of things, but whenever I talked about youth programs, it fell flat on officials and anybody I was talking to. It was very hard to get, and I've tried to understand why people, local institutions are not that, don't seem to be, I might have gotten it wrong, I'll admit I might have gotten it wrong, but it didn't seem like, it always seemed that I was more enthusiastic, or donors were more enthusiastic about youth programs than were recipient communities. I think it could be a result of tradition, could be a result of the competitiveness. I mean, livelihoods are scarce, and if you bring youth along, they're competing for someone else's livelihoods. There might even be some political apprehensions about youth being mobilized or organized or empowered. That's the first question. Second question is, maybe it goes back to the earlier panel, is that I really get excited about the notion that we can train and empower and focus on youth in Afghanistan. I spent a lot of time on secondary agricultural schools trying to, strengthen them. But I also worried about, you say they really need to have a hope and a stake in society. It really has to be connected somehow with income generation and programs that becomes very sticky business. You can't just simply encourage and train and leave it at that. There's got to be a plan forward, or otherwise you have a worse situation. The other question I have is about the durability of human capital in conflict. Training people, or say in the pre-conflict period, if you focused on human capital, how durable is that human capital, and how important is that human capital during and post-conflict? If sometimes trained and entrepreneurial people become the targets, they're the first ones to be targeted, and or the ones who leave. You actually enable them to leave the country, which is all probably maybe a good thing in their case. So those are sort of the three questions. If you have any thoughts about the durability of human capital before, during, and after conflict, as compared to other forms of capital, should it have been bridges instead, or roads, or whatever? And also, the jobs question, as well as the attitudinal issues from governments about whether they really want youth programs or not.
I'll start, but I also do want to hear about the other panelists. Sure. In countries that are traditional patriarchal, head of family and clan prefer to see youth as theirs to control, and they want resources that will help them control and compete in their communities. Now, this is less of an urgency in countries that have more security in institutions. This is why I say, if you have some institutions that provide a framework for elite cooperation and bargaining and cooperation, they're more inclined to see youth development as something that they can invest in for their future. But if the elites are in a competitive situation, they will want to control the youth of their communities as a resource for the competition. The other issue you raised, remind me there was something in addition to that.
So in between was the jobs question.
Yes.
That's a very troublesome aspect.
Yeah, the troublesome issue, again, it's systemic. I was talking to Paul about agricultural complexity. It doesn't do any good to train farmers if the roads that would take their crops to market are not secure. If they have no place to store the crop, why should they increase their output? They're best off just to grow enough for their families to consume during that year, because the rest is just prone to predation and invites people to come in from outside. So you're absolutely right. Again, when you think about training people for an economy, it's got to be for a functioning economy, not in the absence of that. But in terms of your brain drain, that was the other question I was going to ask. Are you training people to leave? If you build a bridge and you're in a conflict zone and people blow it up, it's gone. If you train young people, they're in a conflict zone and they leave, the potential is still there for them to come back when things improve. And most conflict countries have been enriched by expatriates that have returned when conditions are viable. Everything depends on whether they see conditions as viable and whether they have a legitimate, secure framework in which to return and invest their efforts. So I think the human capital that you build through people has greater long-term potential to help, even if in the short term, like a bridge, if you're in a conflict zone, you lose it.
Yeah, I think in our case, the natural resource base of the areas that we're working is basically not sufficient for the populations. So, and we can try and build agricultural incomes, but it's not going to solve the problem. So people are leaving those areas that we're working in. There's this vast migrant. Every household, typically in our mountainous areas, somebody is leaving. So we're looking there to build the skills of some of those young people so that they can get a job in Moscow or wherever it is in Tehran that they're going to. And they are sending money back. Not everyone, of course, not everybody is able to do it, but particularly people in Moscow are getting quite good salaries. They're sending now significant amounts of money back, say, to Tajikistan. That money is really becoming a major investment source now. And so they have been familiarized with those community organizations. They trust those community organizations. So instead of just sending money back to their individual families, they're actually sending money back to their communities and asking the communities to invest that money through these community structures. So in the sense of building capital for people who will leave, that's actually a deliberate strategy. And we know they'll leave. We're definitely interested in building their skills. Certainly, obviously, incomes is very important, but it's just there are limits to the agricultural resource base. I forget the other part of your question. Was it
durability of capital?
Oh, that's okay.
Of communities toward youth empowerment.
Yeah, I think you maybe you're right on governments, but our experience is that communities certainly recognize the desirability of those investments. So empowering communities to get that message across to their governments is perhaps one way to go on that.
There's been an interesting conversation about community-driven institutional structures of cooperation and government-led, but not a lot of reference of private sector, universities. Your mention of the diaspora made me think about both the positive and negative roles. And I guess I wonder if we're being a little bit too narrow in focusing on aid resources and national, local, and do we, I'd like to invite you to comment on opportunities institutionally. Clearly, educational institutions, non-governmental, offer a role, and private sector. And I know the Aga Khan Development Network is kind of at the head of developing some multi-input area development concepts and others. So could you talk a little bit about, and let's think a little bit about the future, right? We're very constrained by what we've experienced in the past, but the conflicts that we're looking at 5, 7, 10 years out are going to have a whole different nature to them. What should we be looking at what's worked and what suggests to have some potential for the future?
Yes, certainly. AKDN as a whole, I'm working on the rural development part of it, but if you look at AKDN as a whole, obviously there are a lot of separate investments going on. There's this idea, as you say, of multiple inputs, whether you're talking about building health institutions, educational institutions. So it's an institutional building approach. Obviously, securing funds for those institutions is a struggle over the long term, but it's also private sector investments, whether it's in energy companies or telephone companies. Is also part of those multiple inputs. It's recognizing the vital role of the private sector is absolutely critical, because you could say that the grant element of the development story is a phase that they're going through. This is not something that's going to go on forever, and we've really seen that in some of our program areas. That's certainly the importance of those aid flows has certainly decreased relative to the private sector and these other local institutions in the role of development. And so you could say that's the AKDN approach, is to see those multiple approaches and making sure you're getting those long-term investments in place as you sort of have these grant programs. And even those grant programs, we're hoping can build institutions rather than just the short, not just the short-term benefits. So, I can talk a little bit about, say, some of the microfinance activities. So, Aga Khan, the AKDN has set up microfinance banks. Again, with they're meant to be profitable. They're meant to make money. They're not. They've been set up with grant funds. That's a struggle. It's a hard work in some of these remote rural areas. It's just very difficult to have to fund those overheads. So they work better in the towns, in the urban areas, and so we're looking at, again, more inventive ways of getting communities involved in delivering some of those financial services in the remote areas on a profitable basis. And our experience is basically, yes, there is that human capital that we've built up in those community organizations can be utilized for private sector interventions. So I'll take the example in Tajikistan, where money that the communities saved up in these local community organizations, they invested in microfinance organizations that are quite profitable, and they're taking dividends back out of those. So they own and control those microfinance. The village organizations, basically through their federations, have invested in these microfinance organizations and get a dividend back. It's so profitable. And what's critical is that because it's their money, they are making sure the loans go to the right people. So there's a very cheap delivery system. So our formal microfinance banks basically have to employ credit officers and have buildings and all the rest of it, quite expensive structures, so that they can't operate profitably in the remote rural areas. Whether these community-owned structures have much lower costs and are effective. So we've got the incentives right there for a private, you could say, it's a profitable enterprise. These micro-lending organizations are profitable, but owned by the community, and they are using those dividends to go back into their community investment funds, which they then gives them an incentive to sort of get together and decide how to spend that money. So there's a multiplicity of, I would say, more private sector oriented interventions. Yeah.
Similarly, the criticism often of donors that we crowd out that kind of more community-based efforts in our post-conflict assistance efforts.
Yeah, we've our programs. There was, as I say, when the grant money is very available in the early stages, we want to try and build that asset, take that asset, not spend all of that money, and put that money into investment funds. Donors typically don't like that. They want us to spend the money all within a program life cycle. And some donors have been, fortunately, very flexible and allowed us to build up revolving funds, which we've then handed over to the control of the community. So that was something we found extremely successful, but donors don't like it. They worry that they're losing control of that money. They don't see it spent, and they think, what's happened to it? And so we've had big arguments with donors who, I think we built up. So, for example, in Tajikistan, there was a $2 million revolving fund was built up with GTZ money, German government money. And it took 2 years to persuade them to allow us to put that into a trust fund under the control of communities. But they did eventually agree to it.
Does anyone else want to respond about universities, academic organizations, institutional arrangements outside government and their potential? And that would be a clear area of interest of Texas A&M.
Yeah.
Okay, please.
Hello? Okay. Yeah, I have along the theme of Go Direct, the local community groups federated into larger groups. It seems to me we have a wonderful opportunity here for partnership or collaboration, at least a model here, where it sounds like Aga Khan has had some very real successes and good experiences. So maybe we could ask you, Mark, what do you see as research priorities in these local groups? What are some of the questions that Aga Khan is asking about how to help these local development groups go forward, and how under the Higher Education Solution Network can we support activities that you do?
One of the questions we've got is the right level for these federations. So it's often very, I mean, the context is obviously all important. But say, for example, I'll give you a question that we're facing, say, in Tajikistan at the moment, is do you federate people up to, say, a district level and even a provincial level, or do you just leave the federations at a very local level where people know each other and these federations are quite strong? So basically, do you federate up to, say, 20, 30, 40 villages, or do you then start creating sort of multiple tiers of federations up to higher levels? The argument for going up to these higher levels is that then you're interacting with more powerful levels of government. And so it sounds theoretically very attractive, but our experience has been it's jolly hard work. Once you lose that link, your footing back in the community, and the community no longer necessarily feel that they're very well represented by these higher level federations. So once you lose that representation and the ability of your local leaders to control these rather large, amorphous organizations that you've created, the glue starts to fall apart. So that's our particular struggle at the moment. Also in Pakistan, these local support organizations sometimes are 100 village organizations, and the community has started to feel, oh no, we've lost control. These people no longer represent us because we've employed professional people. They're almost like NGOs now, as opposed to representative organizations. So now we're having to go back and think, how do we build the capability of those local leaders within villages to govern these federations, to make sure that they are still representative and relevant to their people's needs? Because it's the sustainability argument rests on their relevance. We don't worry too much, frankly, about their financial sustainability too much. As long as they're relevant to people, we believe that people will find a way to make sure that they're funded, one way or another. I mean, it's not, perhaps that's being a little bit optimistic, but certainly we notice where there's been a loss of relevance, then communities are not prepared to contribute financially to maintaining the basic staffing of those federations. And that's when we run into trouble. There's a research question there about how to keep these federations representative, and at what scales can you work at. Obviously, we're trying to push them up to as big a scale as possible, because we realize that to get access to government money, if you work at a district level, that's great, but if you work at a provincial level, it's even better. You can bring more influence.
Could there be aspects of it maybe that it makes more sense to federate? I'm just thinking perhaps in terms of agricultural, of buying and selling of agricultural goods, there could be a common reason to federate, where there may be other very context-specific local things that may be better off that they remain local and not have too much power. I'm just throwing something out on top of my head, but.
Yeah, that goes into another question. We could explore. Do we look at these representative groups that are inclusive and representative of all the people within a certain geographical area, or do we go on particular themes where people are particularly interested in a certain crop, or in managing a pasture, or managing a water resource, and do we federate those up? Is that a more effective way to keep people's incentives? So we're finding, say, in some countries, you're getting a shift from an interest in livelihoods. Say, food security is not such a big issue in some places as it was, say, 10 years ago. People's interests are growing into health and education, so maybe we should focus on federating people around those issues as opposed to some of the livelihood issues. So it's very context-specific as to which types of federations are going to be most effective in particular places. But it's certainly a question that we're dealing with all the time, where to... Or to understand better which incentives, which frameworks to support. And we certainly are not absolutely certain. What I can say is we do know in Pakistan that there is an enormous amount of interest in the communities in these representative federations. But it's certainly not the only model.
Well, I'm sure it'll change as conflicts evolve, yes, the interest of the communities and things. But.
The other thing I wanted to add, when you're talking about private universities, we need to think of education more like we think of medical interventions. When we talked about dealing with malaria, we think about bed nets, spraying, interventions outside the home. And we basically say there are a lot of ways we could do this. What works best? With education, there tends to be a view of reproducing the 20th century American educational system, degree programs, primary education in classrooms, secondary education in classrooms, vocational as a 1 or 2 year thing. this is crazy. There's got to be more productive ways to give people skills. I think it's worth experimenting with 3 or 4 month intensive programs. It's worth experimenting with subsidizing private employers to do on-the-job apprenticeship education in context of learning, of working, rather than schools in the classroom and then jobs. Germany integrates them much more effectively than we do. It may be worth thinking about what is the payback of taking a number of people from developing countries, bringing them to Europe or US for intensive training as seeds to say, you know, we're training you not just so you can get a job, but so you can develop and administer a diverse set of programs. Because we do it from the outside, it doesn't work as well, right? So it may be worth making some targeted investments with people who have leadership skills in countries with the idea that we'll support them with a program, and maybe those programs, as I say, will be short-term targeted interventions. Maybe they'll be funded to go around the country and work with different communities, the way the Aga Khan community does. Education needs to be opened up as a multi-effort evaluation, see what works more in the way we do with other interventions.
I just wanted to briefly touch upon Michelle's question about the role of diaspora and private sector in conflict and development. So diaspora is not really monolithic actor. So some diaspora population might prefer the continuation of conflict, but other diasporas, they organize some of the human rights organizations, some of the PKK groups in Europe and some of the Liberian diaspora. They push for stop using child soldiers and other human rights agendas. So there is a role for diaspora population to be engaged, and the private sector, I think it's more difficult because they are profit driven and they can just exit the conflict zone. But there are some evidences where companies care about human rights if their interests are aligned with their profit motivations. So it might be possible, but it would be more difficult, I guess.
Thanks. Claire.
Just to add to Mark's suggestions on what are specific research questions related to community development, I'll throw out quickly just 3 ideas. I think one specifically is the role of women in community networks.
Thank you. One particularly is the role of women in community networks. There have been 100,000 women in NSP in Afghanistan who've now served on the local community councils, which is just a tremendous network. But I think to be able to research and study how have women played roles as active leaders, as participants, as beneficiaries, is an understudied area. The second might be to actually seek some community feedback on what do they want from the outside. As these communities programs have evolved over time, I think in some senses, and Aga Khan's work accepted from this, but in some circumstances, the support they receive from outside is a little bit top down. NGOs are contracted as facilitating partners in some countries, different arrangements in different countries, but actually to have a beneficiary user feedback in terms of what is it that they value. Is it the social facilitation? Is it engineering support? And so on. And then I think the third area is in areas that are currently affected by conflict, what design adjustments need to be made? How do programs need to work differently when conflict is still active? And there again, the precursor to NSP in Afghanistan was the Community Fora program that managed to negotiate with the Taliban sort of freedom of action to keep basic services going. Are these kind of agreements advisable, or are there other ways to work in conflict-affected areas?
Thank you. Carrie, I think you had a question.
Carrie Grunlow with USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation. I think that this question of how and when to engage with rebel groups is a really important one, and it's one that we've struggled with as a government and as an aid community for many years now. I think it's useful to tease out the type of engagement. So, for example, what sorts of engagement need to happen at the diplomatic level in terms of engaging rebel groups in talks and in fostering elite cooperation locally, not just between donors and government and these rebel groups, but internally within the country, as well as at the military level with regard to security sector reform and DDR as peace processes progress. And then the final area is development. And so I would like to hear more about what you envision. There's quite a difference between engaging rebel groups around the delivery of life-saving humanitarian assistance, and I think that the mechanisms for that are fairly well developed. I don't know that they're utilized as often as they should be, but they're well developed and it has been done, so that's certainly nothing new. And changing troubling behavior, which I think is one of the examples that you've given, versus economic development by engaging groups that are still classified as rebel groups and sort of all of the issues that entails, not just legal restrictions related to certain groups, but ethical considerations, do no harm considerations with regard to cementing conflict power dynamics in local areas, and potentially creating or supporting parallel structures if you're supporting rebel administrations versus government administration, which I recognize may be absent. But what are some of the longer term implications of that? So I realize that's sort of a multi-part question and comment, but there are all of these considerations that I think are important, and this is an important area to study in terms of how and when we should engage with rebel groups. Thank you.
Thank you for the comment. And I think the types of engagement we should do will depend on the willingness and capacity of rebel groups and the characteristics of them. And I'm developing the database of rebel group characteristics with the fund of NSF. And here, I think if the rebel group is willing and capable of controlling their soldiers, military reform, we could certainly talk about it. And if rebel group is willing to enter peace negotiation, Reiko talked about some of these opportune moments, like KNU or KNPP in Myanmar, those groups you can deal with on a diplomatic level. And then some of the rebel groups that are controlling territory, I think it's best to be more engaged in the development issues and how to funnel aid resources to their controlled areas. So I think the type of engagement should differ based on the willingness and capacity and the rebel group characteristics. And the difficult and politically sensitive issue about military balance between government and rebel groups, I think that's primary reason why I chose Myanmar and DRC, because DRC government as well as Myanmar government are opening up and they are willing to invite international community to be engaged with rebel groups. So it's not going to be working with al-Bashir government, for example. So I think the willingness of government to not to restrict access of international community to rebel groups is also important.
Did either of you also want to comment on that point? Okay, Armand?
I think we all understand that there's a great urgency in post-conflict or during conflict, but it's really difficult to do the economic development. That just doesn't seem to work, right, as we've mentioned. Also, make work hasn't seemed to work. I'm not sure there's much work in make work, much less the economic opportunity. But I'm reminded of what Thomas Jefferson said after our American Revolution. And he was concerned with the flood of immigrants that were coming, that we would keep them employed and active and become good citizens. And his idea was, as long as we had land, we'd move them out to the land. He didn't say ownership. They would work the land, and he believed that working the land, toiling with the soil, created hard work, character, and good citizens. And so that was his solution. And I'm just thinking, what about a research project? I know it's a little bit old-fashioned, but what about a research project where we compare hard work versus economic opportunity and maybe working hands in the soil and what that does to the character building?
What I will say, and I think Claire touched on this, is that if development agencies come in with highly paid contractors and offer a cadre of relatively well-paid jobs to interpreters and other local skilled individuals, that takes a lot of the indigenous leadership capacity and deal-making capacity and identifies it with the external agency rather than with the local community, and it breaks some of the bonds that you want to encourage. I think it would be worth trying to identify what are the most productive ways that NGOs can engage the local skilled population in roles that are productive of long-term development. I'm not sure, though, that the distinction between physical labor and other kinds of labor and building character, there's a long Puritan tradition of that. And labor camps do keep one focused on the immediate issues at hand, and they leave people too tired. But the history of rebellion and revolution is such that, the very, very poor tend not to be engaged in that kind of violent activity. On the other hand, a life of hard labor often prepares people to be tough, skilled rebel leaders as well. So I don't see any evidence that I've seen that the type of work that people do, I think really it's the career path or the trajectory they see. Is it a case that they see a legitimate role for the government of their country and they want to do things that will work within it or support it? Or do they see the local government as illegitimate? I mean, what we saw with colonial governments all across Asia and Africa is the more the colonial governments invested in producing better manpower, better local transportation, better economic opportunities, if the local population leadership wasn't allowed full participation by the colonial regime, they just became more skilled and effective rebel leaders. So I think the concept that was mentioned, it's not the youth bulge, it's not unemployment, it's not any of these things that you can address structurally, it's the interaction of these things with a government that is not perceived as legitimate, or with local elites that are in conflict with each other and trying to mobilize people for their conflict. That's the crucial element that one has to address. And if you can address it through direct negotiations with the rebel groups and build cooperative institutions, then I think you get progress, and then you can start to talk about what's the most productive form of labor. But we've seen study after study that shows reducing unemployment or putting people in this or that kind of work doesn't create peace if the basic cleavages and conflicts among community leaders and elites have not been solved.
Please.
So along those lines, what kind of peace reconciliation projects would be the most successful ones, both from an academic standpoint and empirical standpoint? We just mentioned that reducing unemployment, studies have shown that reducing unemployment may not be as successful. So what kind of programs would you recommend, or what kind of research would you recommend that would facilitate in these group reconciliation process?
Are you recommending a research inquiry, or I guess the question is, do we know, is that a valuable research question? Do you feel it is already answered to a large degree?
I think in broad terms, the research points in the direction of substituting elite conflicts with elite pacts, cooperative agreements, inclusive institutions is the direction we want to go. What we need is a better empirical understanding of what have been the pathways that have gotten us there. Why has it would be worth doing a research investigation to make sure we understand why the Kenyan election succeeded as well as it did. And it would be worth investigating a variety of incidents where elites managed to move from conflict to cooperation to see The research I did on this preliminary actually showed that international intervention is usually associated with the failure of elites to work together, because when international interveners come in, they tend to identify, whatever their intent, they tend to be identified locally as being more allied with one or the other partner. It's very hard for them to maintain neutrality. And so they often lead to sustained conflict as groups try to maneuver to either reject or gain control of the support of the intervener. So we didn't find any positive effect of international intervention in terms of elite cooperation. You can't substitute, essentially, for elites coming to agreements themselves. But it certainly would be useful to have a better notion of what kinds of acts or trajectories or bases for agreement. Is the resource curse really a bigger problem in finding elite cooperation, or can you identify cases where management of natural resources was used to bring elites together? Are elections a good forcing mechanism for bringing elites into agreement, or do you need elite agreement before you can have an election that works? All of these things have been investigated, but we're seeing so many, I think, cases in progress where people are trying to work out elite cooperation at the local and national level that I think it's still worth investigating what's working and what's not.
It strikes me that the term project really doesn't help us if we buy into what Jack's saying here, because these are inherently, they may be things that you could influence on the margins with assistance and create institutions or incentives to alter. But that's not really where it is. It's the peace building initiative and the elite pacting, if you buy into this argument of the way that it is. And I guess I defer to others to say whether or not we will sort of buy into that more elite peace building critical precondition, or are there other approaches that need to be put on as alternative explanations?
No, it's an empirical research issue itself.
Yes.
I guess.
Please.
On this issue, let's see if I have all these tables in front of me, so I hope I can spit this question out clearly. On this issue of complexity of research, this got me thinking a little bit about a recent study that was just published by Mercy Corps about youth leaders in Somalia. And it was really rigorously done, and it's sort of part of what got the attention of our office. They got together about 1,000 young people in Somalia and administered all these surveys, and they asked them to what extent they felt economically empowered, which was a reflection of how much skill building they had in their background. And they also asked them a little bit about the extent to which they felt civically engaged. And what they found, to their surprise, was that lots of economic empowerment and lots of feeling like they were civically engaged was more closely associated to a past history of violence, that these people who felt that way were more likely to have engaged in past violence. And it raised, of course, all kinds of interesting questions about what are the impacts of empowering young people in these ways, in these environments. It raises questions, first of all, about what peace-building investments need to be made alongside those investments of the civic and economic empowerment. And it also raises questions about how, to Jack's point, about recognizing that these investments are happening in a system. If you make investments at the same time in more legitimate and more inclusive governing institutions, would you end up with these same results? These are all open questions that demand a couple things, more complicated theories of change about what these theories should look like. That's number one. Number two, to Kleena's point earlier, better data sources about how to measure these effects. And so that's an area where we probably need more work, getting better data to measure the effects we think we should observe. So right away, I think those are two areas that are ripe for more work. And I don't know if there'd be comments from the panelists along those lines.
I don't know that particular study. You say they were youth leaders or randomly selected youth?
They call them youth leaders.
Well, you would expect then youth leaders to generally be people who felt economically empowered and politically engaged, right? And the question is, if you have a society that is racked by conflicts and insecurity, you would expect people who are more engaged and empowered to be involved in those fights. It's kind of the anomic and apathetic who you would expect to sit on the sidelines. Again, that's generally what we see in terms of social protest and social mobilization. A lot of people say, oh, well, lack of education is a problem, and we talked about, education. There was a recent study that was done, Matthew, I can't remember the last name, but I can look for a recent book that basically said you need to look at education as a double-edged sword, because what we find is the leaders of rebel and protest movements are people who have above average education, and that political engagement in violent rebellion is facilitated by education. So if you're educating people into a situation that is politically disordered, chaotic, and lacks stable institutions, increasing education may simply raise the level of conflict or broaden the engagement in conflict. So in a sense, these findings are not surprising.
Can I add one more? We haven't talked at all about political parties as institutions. And, clearly it ties with your own work about the, rebels and how you incentivize them moving into the more formal political sphere. I opened it up. I offer, in closing remarks, potentially I think we have to wrap it up in a few minutes, right? And so what I'd like to do is take a bunch of remaining questions and then allow the panelists to respond. Okay, Malcolm.
I'd be interested in your thoughts about governments operating in conflict environments. And what I mean by that is, well, I'll give you a story to illustrate. I remember having a discussion with Ed about working in Iraq. And it occurred to me that you had more interactions with people and institutions in a month in Iraq than I did in 2 years. So the government officials that are operating in these countries really do not have the understanding or the ability to understand fully the environment that they work in. Now, you can't solve that problem. Recent events are only going to exacerbate the problem of governments, and it's not just U.S. government. Other donor countries have similar kind of problems. But so you can't. What I'd be interested in is your thoughts on how big an impediment that ability to not be able to interact as much as you normally would be able to with the people and institutions. Obviously, one solution would be to just identify the NGOs that can work there, hand them the money, and say, please go forth and do good things. But we have a fiduciary responsibility. We have a program responsibility. So how would you suggest, or how would you observe how we can best deal with that situation?
Couple more. Cleona?
I was just wondering if we could get, excuse me, more comments on political parties. There's two things in particular that I find quite interesting. One is that political militia groups are highly correlated to the number of political parties in the system, not necessarily a transition to democracy, but as we mentioned before, the fragmentation of elites. And the second, coming back to Joe's point about change, if you look at the volatility of ministry positions, so how many have gone in and out or how the government is reorganizing, that's also quite highly correlated to violence. So it comes back to this notion about how elites enter into a system and kind of manipulate it in order to get ahead politically and use violence to do so.
Can I have both of them? Sure. There have been a couple of references to private sector involvement and sort of the ability of the private sector to work or not work in conflicted environments. There are some disagreements in the room, me against everybody else, basically. But that makes it a research topic, one. Two, understanding what the impact is of companies on human capital. They take people, they take them out, they train them, they give them a set of experiences. I don't know that we have any extractive industry or heavy manufacturing people in the room. Maybe they're all out defiling the environment, enslaving the local populations. But that would be a really interesting research topic to figure out what the more definitively what the private sector does and what the impact has been. And I don't think it's something that we've done a great job of looking at.
Yeah, I'd actually like to just pick up on that point as well. I think that the economic issue in terms of elite cooperation is extremely important. In the Kenya case, most of these politicians are businessmen, right? And they saw the impact of the violence on their business, and they had a common interest in not allowing that to happen again. So I think that to the degree that the economy is more open and more shared, right, and more people can participate in that economy, it actually creates a foundation for greater sustainability of peace. And so, I think that, I agree with you, and I also think that it reflects on the question of, do we freeze conflicts? I'm struck by the interest of engaging with militia. And of course, you could also say militia politicians and militia businessmen, right? Because they're also businessmen. Do we freeze it by labeling, or to what degree can we engage and allow people to transition these negative roles and become legitimate actors in their societies? And we've done it ourselves, right? Stanford, if you look at the labor, how he dealt with labor, and, Rockefeller. And there are many others who, when you actually look at how they accumulated their wealth, it doesn't certainly meet our standards today of legitimacy and respect for human rights. And so I wonder to what degree do we allow some of these, actors in these conflict societies to transition into legitimate actors, as well as some of these predatory, natural resource grabbing, economic actors to become the philanthropists and other things of their societies, like we've seen our corporate leaders and monopolists and, robber barons and others become the philanthropists of our society. I think that we have to allow the space for people to transition, and I would be interested in that question.
And a wonderful final framing question. Panelists, would you like to respond? And perhaps what would be most helpful here is to, again, if you can put us towards the research question or tell us if you think it's already been answered.
Who's starting? So the idea is to try and summarize on some of the research questions.
Given these last remarks and what you've heard, where you would take this in terms of the
Again, I'm afraid I'm perhaps just a one-trick pony, and so coming back to the things that we know best, which is on the community, developing these communities and federating them up. But being part of this larger AKDN network, I'm very aware of what our partners are doing in the other areas, and so we very much recognize that it does need a set of multiple inputs to develop a particular area. We're an area sort of focused organization, so we pick an area and we try and develop the multiple inputs that we think that area needs for its overall development, whether it's agriculture, private sector, universities, schools, health systems, or community organizations, civil society, in other words. So I guess the broadening up the research, just taking a broader look at the research questions is, what do you need that multiple set of inputs to have an impact on conflict? So in other words, there aren't any magic bullets on, I've been talking a little bit about the community development, but I'm very aware of the limits of that. I mean, there's this conflict coming from all sorts of directions. That can only deal with certain situations. It's not a full solution, obviously. I think it makes a valuable contribution. But maybe there is a research question around the need for multiple inputs into a particular area to solve a problem. I mean, it sounds self-evident, really, in a way. There aren't any magic solutions. I don't know how you can research such a complex question. In other words, the risk is that we're going to research just parts of the story, not the full story. I'll leave it then.
Just a quick comment on political parties and rebel groups. So there are research that there are successful cases where rebel groups develop into successful political parties, FMLN in El Salvador and ANU in South Africa and RENAMO in Mozambique. So people are studying that. And research finds that inclusive elite pacts are good for keeping peace. But what we don't know very well is what kind of programs that we could develop to have better elite pacts, and that's what we don't know very well.
I think on parties, Scott Mainwaring's done a lot of work on parties in Latin America where he shows institutionalized parties are better for stability, parties that are identified with a single individual are not good. We've done work on factional relations, that if parties exhibit factionalized, non-cooperative, violent behavior toward each other, that's bad. If the parties cooperate with each other, that's good. I think what we need more research on is the role of ethnicity and party in Africa. Nigeria had a plan to prevent parties from being dominated by ethnic groups, but it degenerated into a kind of everybody agrees to have the same corruption as before, but we'll do it on a party rather than region or ethnic basis. So we just rotate the parties. That didn't work. Kenya, I was struck that the ethnic composition of the main parties radically altered from the last election, and those new alliances seem to have been beneficial rather than harmful. Why that worked, I'm not so sure, but I think, again, it's worth looking at what configurations of party and ethnic identification have not made things worse. So I think that's one new area that is worth studying. As far as the government and in conflict environment, there's the inkblot approach that was suggested by Andrew Krepinevich. He basically says you can't do development or peace building in a conflict zone, and you can't pacify a whole country at once. So you should focus your development efforts on areas that have been cleared of enemy combatants and conflict. I mean, in Afghanistan, if you look at Kabul or Mazar al-Sharif, you say these are great successes. Development has been fabulous. You look at the construction, the education, the economic self-sufficiency. They're successes, but that's not where the problems have been. The problems have been in Kandahar and other parts of the south. And the real question for Afghanistan is going to be, is the investment of private businesses and warlords in the functioning areas going to be resilient enough to deal with the disorder that will tend to spread from Kandahar as international forces are drawn down? I don't know the answer to that either, but I do think the answer lies in a research project that might show how crucial the growth of private businesses as an alternative to government in providing a different foci for elite activity, resilience, independent resources. I've always felt that the best antidote to making government the sole object of elite contestation is to have a private sector that's strong enough to keep the elite otherwise engaged. But I think there's definitely a lot of room for research on the role of private enterprise in conflict-riven, early emerging economies.
Well, thank you. I think we've had a very diverse discussion. I think it's brought in, I think when we walked in, sort of the institutional arrangements seemed to be sort of the obvious, and I think we've rounded it out quite a bit, and I think it's been very helpful to think about elites with their multiple identities and affiliations and pacts, whether it's in the economic sphere, in the political sphere, in the other areas where they're contesting power and how that plays out. So I think we have more than enough to work with for the agenda and things that we can feed into the subsequent days on issues of land and natural resources and others where this also plays out. So thank you very much, panelists, and thank you for wonderful questions. Appreciate it.